Hi, this is the second half of the presentation on salvation history and covenantal traditions. We'll look at covenantal traditions in this presentation. In some ways, I want to propose that this is sort of a version 2.0. It's still talking about a timeline, but it's portrayed through the lens of covenant and not so much through these great events in history per se. And let's start in maybe what might be perceived as an odd first question. But Rabbi Heschel once asked his students, who's the most tragic figure in the Bible? And immediately his student said, oh, that's easy, Job, man of suffering. And Rabbi Heschel said, no, not Job. Another student said, King Saul. He lost his kingdom because he became jealous and mad at the success of King David. No, not King Saul. Well, another student said, how about Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, thrown into a cistern, rejected by his people? Not Jeremiah. Other students threw different possibilities out there. Each one, Rabbi Heschel said, not that person, not that character. And finally said, no. The most tragic figure in the Bible is God. Because God, through various covenants, continually reaches out to us, and we human beings slap away his hand every time. So God is the most tragic figure or character in the Bible because he continually reaches out and is rejected. So that brings us to this topic of covenant, since God continually offers this covenantal relationship. Now in Hebrew, the word for covenant is berit, which literally means to cut. And the reason for that is because the way you made a covenant in the ancient Mediterranean world, and we've actually dug up texts, cuneiform texts, which describe this ritual, in which what would happen is that if one king, more powerful king, has conquered another king, the king he has just defeated would be forced to make a covenant, to make an agreement, a contract. And basically the agreement was, look, the king who's just been defeated, you're going to give me tribute. You're going to give me slaves, you're going to give me barley, you're going to give me lambs. Every year, you're going to give me this tribute. And if me, the more powerful king, gets attacked by my enemies, you're going to send me some troops. In exchange, the deal is, me, the more powerful king, will protect you. Okay. So there it is. And the way they sealed that covenant, the way they sealed that agreement, is they would slice animals in half, make a trail between them, and they'd say, now, you, the defeated king, walk between those animals. Clearly a metaphor for if you don't keep your end of the bargain, I'm going to come back and slice you in half, king. And, this is sort of like putting the head of the horse that we see in the Godfather movie on steroids, right? So you have this example of shown here of a person walking through the blood, the trail of blood, and creating these blood-soaked footprints, so they're being imprinted within the person's mind that if they try to rebel, bad things are going to happen to them. And why tell you that story? Because we have an example of that story in Genesis. In Genesis chapter 15, what happens? First off, God comes and says, I'm going to be your shield. I'll protect you. Okay, that's what we'd expect to hear from the more powerful king. And what's interesting is we see when God makes a covenant with Noah, he puts the rainbow in the sky. It's almost like that's another war implement. He's taking the bow and he promises never to destroy the world by flood ever again. Well, here God promises to be the shield, the protector. And he promises, but this is sort of interesting, then God promises to give Abraham, if you will, tribute. He promises to give him offspring, and descendants as numerous as the stars, and also land. Interesting. And it's interesting because then the statement says in the text, Abraham put his faith in the Lord, who credited it to him as an act of righteousness. Now in Hebrew, although you'd naturally think that, okay, Abraham put his faith in the Lord, and then the Lord credited it to Abraham as righteousness. The Hebrew is ambiguous, but the most natural reading, grammatically, is that actually it's saying that Abram put his faith in the Lord, and the Lord, Abraham credited to the Lord as an act of righteousness. So in other words, why did Abraham put his faith in the Lord? Because Abraham considered the Lord righteous. A little different reading and understanding of what this text might be working. Now, the next part's even more interesting, because what happens? The Lord tells Abram, slice this set of animals in half. Abram does that, and then sits there and swats away the flies. Then a burning torch, a brazier, walks, clearly a symbol of God, walks between the animals. Wait a minute. Now, at this point, this is like a plot twist. Your jaw should be dropping. This is a more phenomenal plot twist than anything that's shown up on Game of Thrones. Because here is the more powerful, isn't it? The more powerful figure who promised to be the shield. That's what the more powerful figure is supposed to promise. But then he's giving, if you will, tribute. He's giving the gifts. Wait, that's wrong. But then secondarily, he's walking through the trail between the split animals. The blood-soaked path. So God is actually saying to Abram, look, if I don't follow through on what I promised, let this happen to me. Of course, ultimately that comes about in some ways, although not because God was never faithful, but as a way of continually striving to create relationship with us on the cross. God goes on the blood-soaked path for our salvation. So it's really a phenomenal story. Covenant is cut, but God takes the weaker party's position for our sake. Now what's interesting is there's another story, which is in Genesis 17, in which now it's sort of our turn to cut a covenant, if you will. Because here it reported in 17 that Abram walks blamelessly before the Lord, and again God promises offspring in the land. He changes Abram's name to Abraham, and now God says, okay, now you need to have all your people and circumcised. So again, using the cutting, the covenant. It's cut, and clearly the idea here is that this source of fruitfulness is dedicated to God. This the gifts that God will give, the offspring that He will give, are marked by this ritual action, and if they don't cut that covenant, then the people are no longer, then they're cut off. They're cut off from the covenant. All right. So interesting. We have both God's. Well, we saw this within our theological lectures. The elevation of the human being in terms of Genesis 17, and the condensation of God, where God becomes, if you will, taking the weaker position. He's putting himself in the position of servant to us. And now in Genesis 17, it's the elevation. We have to live the laws of God so that we may be with Him. So, the covenantal traditions, I think, are more focused not on human faithfulness, but on God's faithfulness. They're primarily trying to stress how God stays faithful to His promises, and that the covenants are created because God desires to create what I call here fruitfully faithful communities. That's a mouthful, but I think that's the idea. The other way we talk about that within Christian tradition is that God wants us to be happy in this world and the next, is kind of our language for that. But here, fruitfully faithful community. That's what God desires for us, because that, at the biblical text perspective, that is happiness. So He tempts over and over again. God so desires that He will try to set the world right. He'll reorder it, recreate it, try to form these committed relationships with a people so that we can have those fruitfully faithful community. Obviously Adam and Eve is this first attempt through creation to create relationship with us. We already talked a little bit about Noah when Cain and Abel, situation happens when Cain kills Abel, and the world sort of degenerates. Then God tries to recreate it by wiping it clean and starting over with Abraham. But immediately that falls apart because Noah's adult kids kind of fall into drunkenness and debauchery. So God says, okay, let me try this again. Let me start with Abraham, who doesn't have any kids. So those kids won't be, already soiled before I try to create this new order. I'll start with Abraham and move forward with Sarah to create a new people. And that, as we'll see, also falls apart. They're not totally faithful. So then, through the Exodus story, okay, let me try another one. I'll create a covenant with the folks who were in slavery. I'll bring them out of slavery, and out of their gratitude, I'm sure they'll respond. I'll create a society that's ordered around these laws. I'll give them a law so it's clear what I want them to do. Well, that falls apart. And so then the people ask for a government. Actually, God doesn't want to give them a king. But he says, well, I'll give them what they want. I'll make this, raise up a king. And ultimately with David, he even creates a covenant where he says that household will exist forever. The Davidic covenant. And that falls apart. The kingdom divides. The kings aren't faithful. Before that, we have Solomon, of course, where he creates a temple. It's like God says, okay, here's another way. I'll stay connected to you. I'll reach out my finger to you because I'll localize my presence within the temple so that you can approach me in a direct way. I'll be in a place for you so you can always find me. Well, they start to abuse the temple, and so that falls apart. Well, we talked a little bit about Jeremiah. Jeremiah says has decided to create a new covenant. He's going to write it on our hearts. He's going to write the law on our hearts. Okay, maybe those tablets, they're externalized. You have to go read them. Now they'll be imprinted in your heart, so there'll be no way you can't follow your heart, right? You'll know them. That doesn't work either. It's almost like God, through these covenants, continually hits the restart button. Over and over and over again, he says, okay, let me try it. That didn't work, let me try this. That didn't work, let me try this. That didn't work, let me try this. Always wanting to create this fruitfully faithful community with us and for us. And finally, of course, he says, okay, last chance. I'll send my son, Jesus Christ. And as we've already talked about, it almost takes it back to the beginning, because it's through the blood-soaked path that God will try to redeem us once again, to create this faithful community of love between us and Him. So when we think about this, I think one of the things we've discovered is that there's a lot of metaphors you can use for the Bible. How do we describe it? As we go along, I'm going to talk about a metaphor, which is the DNA, the Bible's DNA. I think one of the DNAs within it is covenant. What I like about DNA is there's two strands, right? If you know the structure of DNA. And that creates, from that grows all of human life. So right now, all of us have our human DNA. Certainly we have different experiences, we have new ways of interacting with the environment around us, but in some ways we're already defined by our DNA. We can't escape our DNA. Well, so too with the Bible. There's sort of a relationship, and I think that the way this got described in class was that the fullness of revelation has happened. There's going to be no new public revelation. Why? Because we have our DNA. We have the DNA of God already in us, if you will, through these covenants, this covenantal relationship. It's been set. Now, yeah, we're going to have new experiences. We're going to grow, just like my human body has grown over time. Some not so good ways, and some great ways. And so that will certainly be new. I will be, even in some ways, a new person, but my DNA never changes. So in that sense, I'm never new. I'm fully who I am from the moment I'm conceived. In some ways, even determined by that DNA. And I don't need DNA from aliens or anything else to be fully who I'm called to be and to have this fruitfully faithful communion with God and with others. That, I think, is the idea there when we say there's no new public revelation. We have the fullness of what we need to be revealed to us. And that imprints within us this DNA, this covenantal DNA. So with that, we'll take we'll continue to unpack this over the course of this semester.